Hi, HDFS 32. Welcome to your first lecture in our unit on dying. And in this lecture, just so you know, we focus on adults. We'll talk about children and adolescents and the dying process later in the semester. And we also don't focus on sudden death because that also comes later in the semester. This lecture is primarily built on these two sources. A textbook on death and dying by Core and colleagues, and our current required text book, A Beginner's Guide to the End. It's hard to determine when someone is actually dying, and if you go in hindsight, you probably realize by the time you say someone's dying, they've probably been dying for some period of days or weeks or even months, longer than when you designated. We'll get more into the challenges for physicians of determining when someone has, for example, 6 months or less to live and is eligible for hospice, when perhaps realizing that the medical treatments aren't really going to be that effective, even if we continue to pursue them, and when this all gets communicated between doctor, patient, family members, and it becomes, something that people accept. Okay, so what is a good death? Oftentimes students say without pain, and we will definitely be talking about pain management. People sometimes say not dying alone, and I think for a lot of people that's true, being able to have family or friends there. And then there are the occasional person who would prefer that everybody just leave so that they can die quietly and they don't have to feel like a burden or be stressed in that way. I think people often talk about feeling like it was a life with minimal regrets, that you've come to terms with it, that you've dealt with any unfinished business. Those are the things I often hear from students. So during the movies, people often die in the presence of other family members, and sometimes we get that, but a lot of times people end up dying, kind of slipping away and dying alone. This is because, as we're going to be talking about repeatedly, our medical advances make it hard to actually figure out when someone is dying, when no more can be done. If that's how we define dying, I don't know that that's actually accurate. When someone has dementia, they don't have the awareness to sometimes the communication skills that allow us to judge, how far along they are in the dying process. When we are using sedation to keep people comfortable and to manage pain, that can make it hard to judge. Are they dying? Are they just really sedated and kind of recovering? In medical facilities, we don't have people who can just sit with dying individuals. Those of you who work in medical facilities know that. And so when people are in medical facilities, if their family isn't there, then they're probably going to be dying alone. And then, of course, during COVID, that made it really hard because that prohibited visitors. And so we had an unusually high amount of people dying alone. Okay, this is a short TED Talk which introduces some ideas that we're going to be talking about both in this lecture and later in this unit about how we struggle to talk about death in our culture, how we don't all have enough advanced directives, which is a major project in this class, how we tend to over-medicalize death, and that decreases the quality of life at the end, and these issues around human euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide or dying. So pause for a moment and think, why do we have such a hard time talking about death and dying, both in our general culture, our families, with our friends, and in our medical environments? Why is it so taboo? Is it because by saying it, we're going to make it come true? Is it because we don't know what to say? Is it because we're afraid of making someone upset? I think those are probably some of the big reasons. And so hopefully the material in this PowerPoint and in our next one on helping dying individuals will kind of give us some tools to be able to talk about difficult things. So in this PowerPoint, I'll be going into a few different theories and models. The factors influencing dying model, we'll be talking about awareness contexts. Kubler-Ross, the famous Kubler-Ross and her stages of dying, which is actually how they were written, not as stages of grieving. The more contemporary tasks of dying model, this is the one that's most commonly used, and some relevant theories from family studies that can help us understand families during the dying process, family systems, family stress, or attachment theory. So this model, the factors influencing the dying process, helps us understand, what are the general categories that makes every person's dying process unique. Just like, as we'll get to, every person's grieving process is unique. So we've got this whole category focused on what is the characteristics of the dying person themselves, what about their loved ones, what about the dying event, and what about the healthcare systems and media. So just to give a more specific example, I'll tell you about my mother-in-law's dying process, which happened in 2021. So in April of 2021, she got a diagnosis that came kind of out of the blue. She'd been having some stomach issues, but got a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. They found a tumor, and it was fairly advanced. And pancreatic cancer is known for progressing pretty rapidly, and so she died within 3 months from when she found out. Okay, so that's a little bit of background. She was 80 years old. So about her, she's Jewish in terms of ethnicity, but not in practicing religion. So there was no religious kind of discussion or overtones in her kind of process of dying. She really just had relationships with a couple of remaining extended family members and her kids and her kids' families. She'd had some conflict in other extended family relationships, and so she only had a small group of people at the end. She had always been incredibly independent, incredibly athletic and fit, and very stoic. She definitely did not want to be a burden. She was determined to stay on her feet and be out of bed as much as possible through her chemotherapy and recovery process. And she was incredibly stoic in the face of pretty intense pain. And she did have good support from my husband, Jordan, and his sister, Kelly. And so a little bit about them. Obviously, they also Jewish by ethnicity, but not in practicing religion. Didn't have conflict in their relationship, and so they were both local and navigated these doctor's appointments and supporting her well. Middle-aged, right, with kids of their own, so feeling that, competition between taking care of their mom, taking care of their own children. Both Kelly and Jordan tend to minimize their distress, so they're not really, either one of them, very emotionally expressive, focus on tasks. Would be one of their main coping strategies, both very good at kind of focusing on tasks, and both having pretty good support. If we go down to the dying event, as I mentioned, pancreatic cancer is known for having a pretty fast and painful, sadly, dying trajectory. And so the pain management became such a big part of the dying process because it was very hard to manage. And we'll be talking more about that when we talk about palliative, or talk about kind of some of the tasks of dying in this PowerPoint. Audrey was determined to die at home, not in a hospital, and so she went to kind of extra measures to make sure that she was on hospice, that she didn't go to a hospital, made her wishes clear. Her death, was one of those, like some of you have experienced, where it was both expected and unexpected. We knew she was going to be dying. I thought it was going to be pretty within the next few weeks. Other family members thought maybe months, and it turns out she died fast, like within days of when we got onto hospice. And so it did have this unexpected quality, which also led my husband to not be present at the time of death, which when we get to grief is difficult for him. There was nothing we could do to prevent it. So this was not something where there was a medical error or anything. The only thing I could think of is that chemotherapy probably made things worse for her, probably hastened her death. And in hindsight, if she hadn't done chemotherapy, she might have not lived forever, but maybe for another couple of weeks or months. In terms of the healthcare systems, things went pretty smoothly, but that was in part because I knew about palliative care, I knew about hospice, and I initiated all those systems. Once they were going, I felt like they coordinated themselves well, but I'm not sure that people would have initiated them as soon as they needed to have been initiated. And in this, as she did have advanced directives in place, we knew about that as well. In terms of media, that wasn't involved, obviously, in this dying process, but that could influence other people's dying processes when it's getting media attention. And that can be validating, that can be distracting, that can be challenging, it can have a number of different effects. Okay, great. So the answer to this question would be the dying trajectory is most characteristic of the dying or death event. So not so much as part of the dying person, but this one would go under the dying event. Okay, let's talk about awareness contexts. This is an older model, but still useful. And what you can see is it has 4 categories there: closed, suspected, mutual pretense, and open awareness. And then 3 dimensions: the awareness of family and medical professionals that the person is dying. And you can see in all 4 categories in this model, the family and medical professionals are aware. The second dimension is the awareness of the patient, and you can see that that varies. And then the third dimension is everyone communicating openly about it? So for closed awareness, family and doctors, medical professionals know, but the patient does not, and no one is talking about it. And this is definitely kind of the older view of dying, especially when before Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came into the scene, that we just don't even talk about it, and we don't even tell anybody that they're dying. And in fact, there was a little book written by my death and dying teacher in the 1990s called "If You Want to Know If You're Dying, Ask the Cleaning Lady," meaning like the janitor or the custodial services coming in might be able to look at your chart and actually tell you if you're dying because no one else is. That relates to suspected awareness, which is very similar, except the patient has some suspicion, right, that they might be dying and no one's talking about it. Mutual pretense is like, yep, everyone knows, and no one's talking about it. So it's the elephant in the room. And in all 3 of these, people might be saying things like, you know, let's focus on the bright side, or aren't you looking great today? Or let's talk about something more cheerful, or you don't mean that, you're not going to die, right? So just more death denial. And then in the 4th category, which is what we generally think we're going for, that's open awareness, right? Where everybody's aware and everybody's talking about it. It's harder to do, right, than it sounds. And we'll also talk about kind of maybe sometimes people don't want that, and perhaps there are some pros associated with denial. So Miller and Berger have a nice way of thinking about awareness context, is that you could have a transparent kind of pre-conversation with your medical provider before things go badly, or before you're entering the dying process, to talk about when things get bad, or when you might be dying, how should we handle it? And so that people might have different options. A lot of students choose option 2, that, ask me first, because I think it gives you a preparatory statement. Like, would you like to talk about kind of what my thoughts are on prognosis? And option 4 would be, I don't want to know directly, but I'd prefer that you tell, somebody else who's important to me. So we'll begin a conversation about kind of pros and cons of denial regarding the dying process. So it seems to be more harmful when we deny someone else's dying process, because then research suggests that we tend to avoid them, because we don't want to, deal with something, we're kind of ignoring something really hard. We don't, really give them a chance to talk about it and support them in a more vulnerable way. And we can give kind of false reassurances, right? That they're not going to die, or they're doing great, when in fact that's not true. When someone is denying their own dying, you can see how that could be their personal choice. And so in some ways that might be adaptive. It might allow them to kind of focus on hope, or the potential of a cure or recovery. Yet it could create challenges for loved ones and providers who maybe see something else coming down the line, want to be able to get ready for that, want to be able to deal with unfinished business, want to be able to say goodbye, and yet the person isn't allowing for that. In this TED Talk by Amanda Bennett, she does a really great job of talking about some of the pros of denial and how it really benefited her and her husband for many years as they kind of beat the odds around death. But then she also talks about kind of the challenges at the end of life, when they were still in a death-denying state of mind. So you might think for yourself about the pros and cons of denial. And with that, I always poll the class on what they think about denial. Is it more beneficial than harmful, more harmful than beneficial, both, or it depends? And I think that people tend to come on it's more harmful than beneficial, or kind of both. Okay, so let's talk about the very famous Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So she was a medical doctor, a psychiatrist in the 1960s in Chicago. and working in a hospital setting, and she had some theology students come and talk to her about doing a project with dying people. And so basically she set out to find dying people in her hospital that her theology students could interview, and she realized it was really hard to find them. They were often put in kind of obscure parts of the hospital because people didn't want to interact with dying individuals, and it was very hard to get physicians to give permission for them to be talked to about their own dying process. And so she really started to realize that we had this culture of not discussing death, dying, especially with the individuals who were dying themselves. And so that really launched her into, her career path around dying and the famous books that she wrote. So you can listen to this 5 minutes from a Radio Lab interview about kind of with her about what was, or some, with some, not with her, but with some archival recordings of her about kind of how this came about and what was the time period that she was, beginning to kind of create some change. So people often talk about Elisabeth Kubler-Ross in the terms of her stages of grief. And what I can tell you, when we can circle back to that in the grieving process, is that eventually she, along with David Kessler, went on to kind of translate her stages into grieving, but initially they were all about the dying process and what an individual might be going through as they were dying. That initially they would be in denial, experiencing some shock, some other challenges, then more kind of anger, why me? Then kind of this bargaining, if I could just live till the holidays, till my son's birthday, till, whatever it is, kind of events, then I promise I'll do this, and then moving more into kind of their own grief and depression, that this is happening to them, before kind of moving on to self-acceptance. So Kubler-Ross's stages of dying, or stages of grief as they became to be known, really, although they made important contributions to the field, they didn't hold up well under research, because as you've maybe learned, if you're an HDFS major and you've studied other stage models, people don't progress through things just in neat little stages. They can skip things, move around, so there's a lot of variation. However, I think what Kubler-Ross contributed is that she just allowed us to understand how discarded dying people were in our systems, and to see them, to humanize them, to listen to them, to focus on their quality of life, to kind of push through some of our fears. Okay, so if you're testing yourself on this one, it would be that her legacy is really about item D. This is the model that's most predominant in the dying literature right now, and kind of the theorizing or thinking about how we, what are the tasks associated with the dying process. And I would say it's the first 4 that are a formal part of the model, but I've also added emotional as well. For each of these tasks of dying, I'll highlight some of the tasks for the dying individual, but then also kind of mention what the implications are for care providers. We'll be getting more into kind of what to do, what to say in our next PowerPoint on helping caring for dying individuals. Okay, so physical distress, right? And the next slide, I have a number of different physical symptoms which we can take a look at. And then also just managing bodily needs, right? Dealing with bed sores, dealing with aches and pains, dealing with random tubes, managing medications that might be difficult to swallow or, process, just all those kinds of things. Certainly just trying to maintain a positive body image, and this is especially, I think, important for younger people too, but wanting to feel good about yourself. But it can be older people as well, like wanting to have your hair done, or wanting to have your nails done, or wanting to have a nice, shirt on, or just, have your beard trimmed, or whatever it is, so that you just feel kind of good about how you're presenting. So what this means for people who are, whether personal or professional, who are caring is pain management, which we're going to talk about is so hard to do. We'll be getting into that some more with palliative care. But a lot of times the first pain medication doesn't work, and you try something else, and you try something else. Helping support personal hygiene, so oftentimes it's CNAs who can be providing that kind of care both at home and in, facilities. And then managing symptoms. So let's take a look at some of the symptoms that we'd have to manage on the next slide. So I thought this was a really nice list from Miller and Berger of just all the, just a handful, well, not even a selection, right, of symptoms that could be going on for people going through the dying process. So there's the primary disease, and then there's all these other things that are happening because of side effects of medication, because they've been, restricted movements, because of the disease. So all of these other symptoms that end up having to be managed as well. So I know for my mother-in-law going through pancreatic cancer, obviously there was a huge challenge of managing pain. And we tried probably 5 different pain medications and combinations, including CBD and THC. But there was also side effects maybe of the medications or part of the disease process. We were never sure, just some severe swelling in her feet that was challenging, some nausea that made it challenging to eat, so there were other symptoms that became kind of really prominent sometimes. Okay, so some of the aspects of the psychological tasks of dying people need are a sense of security, which we can give them, right, by being a stable presence, by asking questions, by listening, basically trying to provide kind of a secure attachment. If it's a personal relationship, or reliable, kind of being a reliable care provider, if it's a professional relationship. People also need a sense of autonomy and control. And these are things obviously we need all of our lives, but they might intensify more during the dying process. And so we can give autonomy and control by just trying not to take away people's choices prematurely. And so making sure we ask things, not just deciding for them, but asking them, do you want your blinds open or closed? Do you want this light on or off? Do you want this blanket or not? Do you, just all those basic things that they're no longer maybe able to control for themselves, just giving more choice. What would you like to eat? And then this idea of richness, which, we might be seeking kind of all of our lives, just, being able to experience the beauty of life, life's simple pleasures. And so richness for each person is a little bit different. And so trying to figure out what matters, is it a certain smell? Is it the feeling of a certain fabric? Is it having your hair washed? Is it having your hand massaged? What are the things that bring you? Is it being able to look outside and see the trees? Is it being able to be wheeled outside or go outside? So just thinking about what are those simple pleasures that bring a sense of richness to life. This TED Talk is by B.J. Miller, one of the authors of the book that you're reading, and I like it, although it does kind of ramble a little bit at times. If you want to tune in on the part about richness, you could listen to just a couple of minutes in the middle where he gives some nice examples of richness that he's seen in his patients. So maybe think about ways that you already embrace the richness of life, and maybe something that you wish you would do a little bit more of, or a practice you'd like to start. Here's a specific research study that I feel like got at some of those psychological tasks of dying. So this was a qualitative longitudinal study in Canada of about 27 middle to older adults who were dying of either lung or colon cancer, and basically interviewing them and then looking for themes. And so what the researchers found was that dying individuals did have this goal of controlling dying, so it relates to that task or that part of the psychological task of having a sense of autonomy and control. And so they might do this by maximizing their treatment options, like getting a second opinion or trying a new experimental drug. Also, interestingly, considering suicide, and I think that's really probably physician-assisted suicide or dying, also gave a sense of control. And I do think that for people who are fearing a painful death, just knowing that they have that option can ease some anxiety. Another goal that dying adults had in this study was valuing life in the present, and they did that in a couple of ways, either by making positive comparisons, like I've had 60 years, some people have only had 16 years, or conservative planning, like hopefully I've got 2 more months, when in reality, maybe they have longer than that, so that they're kind of happy if they get longer rather than being disappointed. Also, creating a living legacy. We've got some more examples of that on this next slide, but basically that's putting your affairs in order, whether that's financially or with your belongings or messages that you want to convey, and also gestures of altruism. And this can be to family members, but it could also be to medical professionals, like I want to help doctors, understand this disease. I want to contribute to this research, or how can I not be a pain for the doctors and nurses? How can I make their lives easier? So here's some examples from your Miller and Berger book about leaving a legacy, maybe compiling your recipes, your favorite books, putting together slideshows. My dad's a amateur photographer, and I keep telling him, just go ahead and put together your funeral slideshow now, like one of your life and one of all your favorite pictures that I can, show during the reception or something like that. I know it's a little morbid, but writing letters to important people. One of my close friends from high school, her grandma Nora, died a number of years ago, and after her death, I received a letter in the mail because prior to her death, she had gone through her address book and written a card to every single person that she had in her address book, and I was in there. Basically, just a little message about the meaning that they brought to her life. So it's a pretty powerful way to leave a legacy. You might be doing artwork. StoryCorps is part of NPR and the Library of Congress, and I've done some StoryCorps interviews with my parents. It's basically a format of recording an interview that then gets uploaded to the Library of Congress so that it can live forever and future people can access it. And then ethical wills or legacy letters. This is a little bit confusing, but this is this idea that you kind of talk about your values, your beliefs, your philosophy, kind of your ethics, and in a way that you'd like to have live on for your descendants, things you'd like them to know. Okay, so for social tasks, obviously managing those close relationships, dealing with unfinished business, making amends, asking for amends. And then Miller and Berger recommend this around secrets, that you designate a cleaner. And that's not to clean your house out at the end. That's a person who's kind of tasked with keeping any secrets that you want kept. That they'll make sure when all those things are being cleaned out or processed, that those secrets don't get revealed. In terms of interactions with social systems, people need help, right? Deciding how they're going to disclose their illness, how they're going to keep people up to date on what's happening, whether or not they're dealing with social media, they're having someone else do that. And so, as helping professionals, we can often be figuring out, how to help people manage this. When people go through the dying process, their energy level decreases, their social circle shrinks, and so there may need to be family members or friends who are kind of taking on this liaison role to keep other people updated. I thought Miller and Berger had some nice tips around how to talk to your boss, assuming you're still working at that time, and that bosses could go both ways, that you kind of need to be aware of, that they could have a negative bias where they just kind of write you off a little bit, give people other opportunities and sort of avoid you, or they can try to be so helpful that they're pushing you to take time off or focus on you, when in fact you want to still contribute, either because you find your work meaningful or you need the distraction. So maybe kind of just communicating clearly with your boss about trying to avoid either of these scenarios. And so then in terms of spiritual tasks, people want to have a sense of meaning in their own life, that they've made a difference, that they're leaving a legacy, that they have an impact, a positive impact on the world around them. They probably need a sense of connectedness. That kind of overlaps a little bit with security under psychological. It can be a connectedness to their body, to a higher power, to others who are experiencing similar diseases or struggles. And then hopes, right, or transcendent hopes. So first, just starting with hopes, I think it's important to realize that people in some ways need to maintain a sense of hope until the end, even if that hope changed. So maybe in the beginning, they're hoping that they have 2 more years, and then they're hoping that they make it to the holidays, and then they're hoping that somebody that they love is with them, or so the hope can change, or could get smaller or less optimistic, but it can still be present. Transcendent hopes are something around kind of going above and beyond what's ordinary. So I'm hoping for a good afterlife, or a better next life if I believe in reincarnation, or kind of that that I'm living on in the world in some way. Miller and Berger have some nice emotional tasks, and this wasn't part of the original core tasks of the dying model, but I think it's worth highlighting. Obviously, there's a whole range of emotions, just like in life, that we could be experiencing as we're going through the dying process, but some of the big ones are fear, right? Fear of being in pain, fear of the unknown, fear for others, denial, which we've already talked about, not wanting to believe that it's really happening, anticipatory grief, basically for what's already been lost. Well, it can be grief and anticipatory grief. So grief for what we've already lost in terms of capabilities or opportunities or dreams that aren't going to come true, and then what will be lost in the future. I guess that's it. That's just relationships, right? Experiences. And obviously there can be positive emotions too. So the crisis of death can help people experience a sense of acceptance, more love, sense of meaning. But it's often the difficult emotions that are harder for us. And so what we can be doing is providing more active listening and brainstorming, ways to cope. Miller and Berger have some nice, just simple strategies for when people are experiencing painful emotions. And some of these seem pretty obvious, but they might be useful. Looking through ways to have that sense of richness and find joy, often through kind of sensory pleasures, whether it's the sun on your face or the smell of chocolate cookies or whatever. Prayer, ways that you can cultivate gratitude, acceptance, connecting with others, feeling a sense of love, sharing love, trying to be, mindful, breathing, present, maybe looking for a way to try to be creative if that's possible, or just opportunities to laugh. Okay, you can test yourself here. In the Core et al. Tasks of Dying model, the dying person's need for autonomy is considered which of the tasks, and in this case, it's psychological. I think it's worth just mentioning that not only are these, the tasks that we've already discussed, there's just all the logistical tasks. And so Miller and Berger do talk about death cleaning, which is different than designating a cleaner for your secrets, right? But that's, trying not to leave a mess, I think is what they title that chapter, trying to clean things out so that other people don't have to do all that if you're able to. Getting your finances, your insurance in line for after your death, whether that's like, doing some transfers of the titles of your car, the deed on your house, what advance directives and wills, how's that going, anything that you need to manage around housing, just all the equipment that people sometimes need around the dying process, whether that's a bedside commode or a walker or a hospital bed that they can put in their living room or, somewhere downstairs. It might be hiring help for supporting you in your ADLs, which is activities of daily living, so managing food or hygiene issues, and then just making some decisions or some planning around funerals and body care. I think Miller and Berger do a nice job of just pointing out there's some other tasks just around treatment decisions and care goals, and that it's really important to recognize there's a whole continuum between no treatment and then going and accepting whatever experimental treatments are out there in clinical trials. And you can be anywhere on this continuum, and no treatment does not mean that you're giving up. And that's often people's response. You mean we're giving, like you want her to give up? You mean we should give up? And we do have to watch out for that momentum of treatments, or getting on that kind of moving sidewalk of treatments where you just, and I can certainly feel that, like one chemotherapy doesn't work, so then they offer what the next one would be, when maybe they need to also present that another choice would be, this could be hard on your body, another choice is just no chemotherapy and managing pain and keeping you comfortable. So related to that, there's some questions on this slide that are useful for thinking about. You can be asking yourself, or you could be asking physicians, as you think about where you are on the continuum of like extreme treatment versus no treatment. And so thinking about, do I want quality of time, or am I trying to maximize my time? You know, how much time do I want with family and friends? What am I aiming for? What's the goal of the treatment? What are the side effects? If I don't choose it, what are my alternatives? Financial costs. Who do I want making decisions for me or somebody else? And then, let's talk about hospice before we get there. Let's think about when would be the right time to bring hospice on board so that we can really get the full benefits. I'll just highlight this, but I thought this was a nice kind of little worksheet that people could do that could be repeated many times, like what's my situation, what are my goals, you know, whether it's to die at home or to travel or to attend my nephew's bar mitzvah, and then to kind of think about, you know, what my options are. So surgery would take away my ability to swallow, but it would extend my life, you know, or treatment might buy me more time, but it also means that I have to spend more time in the hospital. So kind of just thinking through pros and cons. So far I haven't seen great models from the death, dying, and grief literature on family dynamics and processes. And since I also teach a family studies class, I thought I'd bring in just a handful of family theories. If you've been in HDFS 402, you've heard these. If not, these will be maybe new to you. But I'll just bring in just a little dip our toe into a few family studies theories and how they might inform our understanding of the family dynamics during the dying process. Okay, so family systems theory is this idea that the family has its own kind of system that's interdependent. And so that's often given the example of the mobile, the picture you see there, where if something's happening to one person in the system, right, all the other parts of the mobile are going to have to adjust. And so when someone is dying in a family, then the roles in that system are changing, right? So people are transitioning maybe from having been in their primary role of I'm your partner, or I'm your child, your adult child, right? To I'm your sibling, to now I've also got this caregiver role that's starting, you know, in response to your dying process. I can remember just a funny story when my husband had knee surgery for the first time, and we were in our 20s. You know, I was he couldn't move, you know, basically for several days, and I was having to take off time and kind of be his nurse and help support him. And so I was really in this caregiving role. And I remember at some point we put on a movie, and he kind of patted to me, you know, on the fold-out couch, like, come cuddle with me and watch this movie. And my response was like, I can't watch a movie with you. I'm your nurse. You know, like I clearly had kind of taken on that role. So roles and rules, kind of how we do things in the family will change when someone's going through a dying process. Another family systems concept is homeostasis. So families often have patterns and try to maintain those patterns to some extent. So, you know, in terms of rules and roles, we might have people in families who are the star child, the favorite, or the decision maker, or the one who takes charge, or maybe there's somebody who's the black sheep and we make them out to be kind of the slacker and who doesn't do their part. Families will maybe enact some of those roles and kind of keep people in their roles to kind of maintain a sense of balance or equilibrium, even though it isn't always healthy. You know, so that's why I think sometimes people can react in dysfunctional ways, is because they're trying to kind of achieve some sort of homeostasis or balance in the face of this crisis, and they're not always doing it well. Relatedly is circular causality, or basically patterns of interaction. Systems theory is all about the interactions that are happening between individuals. And so those people can get into kind of some problematic cycles sometimes. One of those could be an overfunction or underfunctioner. You know, one person is doing too much and the other person is doing too little in reaction, and they keep going round and round. But here's another example of circular causality. And this is what I think of as the strong, weak, or emotional, rational pattern that we can fall into a lot of times in our systems. So let's say we have one person who's struggling with his diagnosis, feeling anxious and scared, And maybe his partner is like, okay, I need to protect you from your fear. It's hard to watch this. I need to be positive. So I'm going to focus on the bright side. I think of this as bright siding someone. And that ends up just leaving his partner feeling more alone in feeling scared and feeling like there's something wrong with me, that I can't deal with my fears because you seem fine, right? And then they're almost left holding all the fear. And then that cycle can just keep going. They keep expressing it. They feel more crazy. They feel like they're falling apart more. And the other person gets kind of more strong, more optimistic, And so it's really important that we pay attention to these roles that we might fall into, and we try to break out of them if they get too entrenched. So when I notice myself falling into, like, I'm the one who has it all together in some sort of crisis or situation, I try to make sure that I start to express some vulnerability, that I defer to other people, right? That I don't let us get into a problematic pattern that's not always that healthy. The family stress theory, or ABCX model, is just a great model for any type of crisis, so it can be applied to somebody going through the dying process. So the A in the ABCX model is just stressor events, and obviously there's a lot of them in a dying process. There's the diagnosis, or there's the initial something's wrong, then there's trying to figure out a diagnosis, then there's a lot of waiting in the medical profession, and you're waiting to figure out what your options are and what your prognosis is. And then maybe you have the stress of making a decision around surgery or radiation or, chemotherapy, or and then waiting for, to see how those are go. So it's just obviously a series of stressor events, and with each stressor event, families are having to come up with resources, whether that's medical professionals, financial resources, family members, just dealing with all the logistics. Families are also having to kind of figure out how to cognitively manage, perceive, think about the stressors, right? Like, okay, it's hard to wait, but if it was life-threatening, I'm sure they would be acting sooner, right? So how are you kind of thinking about this? It's hard to think about taking, chemicals into my body through chemotherapy, but I'm going to imagine that it's, getting rid of the disease, those kinds of things. And so combined, the nature of the stress, the nature of the resources, the nature of how we can think about it and manage it, leads to the outcome. And sometimes it's a crisis if basically the stress exceeds our resources and our ability to cognitively manage. And sometimes it's not, and it might at some point be a crisis. There can also be just this pile up of stressors that can lead to kind of a sense of burnout and exhaustion. Definitely, you may know people who have done caregiving for a long time and spent a lot of time in hospitals and doctors' visits. And I talked to one such woman this summer, and it was like she was, spent years caregiving her second husband after caregiving her first husband. And yeah, she was exhausted. It can really take its toll. So family stress theory just helps us think about, for example, what are resources that this family might need so that we can help them cope better? How can we help them without focusing on the bright side, manage how they're thinking about this, make lists, organize their questions, find the right medical experts, that can all be part of the C as well. Okay, so for this one, in this example, if Erica's making a list of questions and concerns to share with her doctor, this in family stress theory would actually be C. Sounds like the doctor is the resource, but the act of kind of how you're cognitively breaking it down into manageable bits by making lists and questions, that would be part of the C, the kind of cognitive processes. So I don't know if you've learned about attachment theory in adulthood yet, but it definitely continues beyond childhood. We need people throughout our lives, and we need a sense of attachment security. So this relates to some of those psychological tasks. And so in our families, right, these are the 4 kind of key attachment behaviors, and we see our attachment behaviors increase during times of stress and crisis. So if you have a loved one dying, you all might just start checking in on each other more. Call me when you get home. How are you doing? How are you doing today, Dad? You might be checking in on with each other and with the person who's dying. That's proximity maintenance, that kind of keeping tabs, seeing each other more, right? That's proximity maintenance. Safe haven is turning to each other when we're in distress. So obviously we're trying to do that. We're going to be experiencing more distress. Hopefully we can be turning to each other and asking for the help and support that we need. We need a sense that we have people we can count on. Separation distress, I mean, that I think is a big part of just the anticipatory grief with someone dying, is knowing that you're going to be separated from them. So that sense of separation distress. Secure base is this sense of I know that I have people who can take care of me, like I can relax, I've got a safety net, I don't have to worry, I can focus on living well, right? It's less about fear and distress and more about like, I've got people who got me. And so one study found that for even palliative care, homes or facilities could create this sense of security and a secure base for people. So it doesn't just have to be family, it could also be institutions. The second thing that attachment theory can help us understand when families are experiencing the death of a loved one or going through the dying process with a loved one is that people develop strategies over their lifetimes that we kind of learn in childhood, but I won't go too much into that, about how we cope when we're in distress. And generally, people can do a mix, but some people tend to amp up more, and they hyperactivate when they're in distress. So when they are in distress, you know they're in distress because they're telling you, they're expressing it, they're upset. And then some people tend to deactivate, detach, shut down, minimize when they're in distress, focus more on tasks. And so we will see these patterns emerge in families too, where some people might be amping up, some people might be tamping down, but it doesn't mean that they're not in distress. It means that they kind of have a way of minimizing it, whereas other people might be ruminating more, spinning in their head. And so just kind of knowing that we can each do different things and trying to support each other in that is important. Okay, before you head off, I just encourage you to pause, try to consolidate some of the things you learned here, not just for an exam, but for your personal and professional lives. Just think, like, what of this do I want to tell somebody else? What of this do I want to remember?